in the time we have, okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. I don't have any relevant disclosures, but I did want to make it clear that I'm purposely not going to talk about some of the big topics that we usually focus on in DEI work, and specifically, intentionally focus on some issues that you might think are on the periphery. And the reason is I don't do canned talks if I can possibly help it. I won't bring the same talk to multiple places. I try to tailor it for the audience. And coming here, I thought, what might they not be hearing that often? And so we'll see if I hit it right or not. So, a little bit of context, and this is kind of preaching to the choir, I understand, but just a little background of why diversity matters. And so, for me, I think it's important to never forget that it's simply the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It is about equity. It's about justice. I love that your Jedi council starts with the justice part. I think that's actually perfect. And obviously, it makes a much more cool acronym when you do it that way. But I think it's just the right thing to do, is why we do it. That said, there's been a lot of talk about the business case for diversity. And that term actually makes me cringe a little bit because it's just like, ew. But from that ewness has come a lot of good data. And actually, most of the literature showing some of the benefits of diversity comes from people who looked at the business case. So we have to acknowledge it served a purpose. And of course, it gets published in things like Harvard Business Review, because that's how that works. But it has actually resulted in some really interesting work coming to light. So you take the good with the slightly cringe. And work, this is from this article on why diverse teams are smarter. It's citing some well-recognized studies. McKinsey in 2015 looked at 366, these were US public companies, and they found that basically, and this, of course, when you say the business case, this is the ultimate business case, shareholders get more money if you have diversity on your boards. And it's 35% increase when you have ethnic and racial diversity in your higher management is what they focused on, and 15% in gender diversity. A larger study that was done globally found that having at least one female board member also yielded higher returns. So this is a small sample. There's actually quite a lot of data now on this. And it served the very useful purpose of convincing people that while it's the right thing to do, there is a financial incentive as well, or at the very least, definitely no financial disincentive to put in the effort. And unfortunately, we live in a world where we value what we monetize, and we monetize what we value. And so I'm not averse to using this data to advance what is actually a noble mission in itself. But let's think about that data, for example. How is it working? How are the people doing better when there are more diverse teams, right? Has anyone thought about that? Anyone have any ideas? Anyone? Anyone want to share an idea, Jill? People think differently? Okay. Any other ideas? Diversity just makes us think differently. I mean, it's pretty close, pretty true. Another thing you might think of, this is something I thought of actually, is perhaps the people who are being selected for these boards and these higher management are exceptional high performers, right? And this would make sense, because if you're from a historically minoritized group and you manage to get to that level, it stands to reason perhaps you're performing way above average. And I'll tell you, when I became a surgery resident a while ago now, it was very much clear, and I just took it for granted, that I was going to have to be at least 1.5 to 2 times as good as the next person to get by, basically because of my outsider status and background. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And so it's not unreasonable to think this might be what it is. But what I find more interesting is the research that's starting to show that what it really is that it changes the whole team dynamic. So just like Dr. Helm said, it makes us think differently. The entire team structure changes when we're more diverse. And I just pulled this slide up because it's from your own Spark Institute. And it's citing a study that I'm about to go into. This is a study that was done by a Tufts University professor, Samuel Summers, and his group back in 2006. It's actually highly cited. It has 804 citations to date. And it looked at not real juries, but fake juries that they created in a psychological experiment. And what they did is they got 200 people. They were 6-person mock jury trials. And they were either all white or 4 white and 2 black participants is how they selected, right? So that was the diversity metric that they were using. And then they had a video, and the trial had white victims and a black defendant. So they definitely set this up along the lines of the diversity metric they were measuring, specific to race. And here's what was interesting. The diverse juries raised more facts related to the case. They were actually more factual in their analysis. They made fewer errors. In fact, they actually had better memories. They recalled evidence more accurately. And this is not just the two Black members of the team. This is the entire team. And in fact, this effect was most pronounced on the white members of the team, if you read the whole paper, which I actually recommend people do. It's actually a really, really well done study. Everyone got smarter when the team was more diverse. They paid more attention. And here's the very interesting thing. It's kind of almost a footnote to this study. It did not result from discussions necessarily. So there was nuances to how they did this study. It wasn't just the discussions with their non-white counterparts, and it wasn't that everyone learned to think better because they brought in different backgrounds and ideas. The change happened from the moment the white jurors knew they were going to be part of a diverse panel. They actually, when they scored them, they became more lenient, was one word used, or one could say more all-encompassing of the facts and the situation before a single word was uttered. So the simple fact that they knew they were going to be in a diverse jury poll made people behave differently before anyone said a word or exchanged a single idea. And that shows the incredible underlying psychology that us as all humans have, whether we want to or not. None of us like to think we're irrational. We all like to think we're completely logical. We're all Dr. Spock. No, we're much more Captain Kirk. We are affected by the people we are around, even if those people don't say a word. And so this was obviously a charged situation, right? It was a fake situation, but it's a Black defendant, white victims, mixed jury. It was on race in America, in a country where clearly this is a hot topic issue, even in 2006. So you could imagine, okay, people are very sensitized. Does it still work if it's not as charged a mix of diversity? And this is the study that I thought you might not have heard about that I wanted to share with you. So there's a bit of research that I could have used, and I picked the one that was the most bland and innocuous version of diversity that was used in the study. This is a Midwestern university that used sororities and fraternities to define its diversity, right? Now, I went to the University of Sydney for med school and undergrad. It's a British system, Commonwealth, so it's the same thing. And I don't understand fraternities and sororities. So this is where your American culture will help me. Who here was part of a fraternity or sorority when you were in college? Seriously, I thought like everybody was. Okay, so it's not a universal thing. Good to know. Learning for me. So this is a Midwest university, and I'm not putting the name of the university out there, but suffice to say, it's in an area that one could imagine is somewhat ethnically homogenous. It's not a particularly notable diverse composition. And they brought in members of the sororities and fraternities, and they're solving a murder mystery. So the stakes are way less here now, right? So even in the pretend scenario, it's a very lighthearted thing. And so they picked some groups from the same fraternity sorority, and others were mixed. And you could imagine that the composition of these sororities and fraternities, for the most part, was probably fairly similar, right? Because I don't know how much legacy there is, but I'm going to assume that in this university, people are kind of similar. And still, with this incredibly mild version of diversity, look what happened. The groups that they call them out groups, if you had a different sorority fraternity person in your group, performed better, but they reported less confidence in the performance, and they perceived the interactions as less effective if you are out group. So if you are in group, if you're all in the same club, you're having a great old time, but you're actually doing worse. And if you're out group, you're not having such a great time, but you're actually doing better. And so the mere presence of out groups, and however that's defined, remember, this is about the most superficial definition of diversity you could have had in that previous study, doesn't matter. If someone is an outsider, however that's defined, they come from the next county, I don't know, it makes us less comfortable, and yet we perform better. Now, that's the thing that I find really striking. And this is on a very, very superficial level. Now, that is a segue. So as you can tell, I'm about to head us into these less obvious forms of diversity, which was the point. And to talk about what are we doing in surgery now, we're recognizing that perhaps there are some less obvious forms we're not really talking about. So this tweet came out early this year and got a little bit of traction. It came out in January and I couldn't resist. And they got a little bit of flack for it. And if you look, this looks like a lovely diverse group going into Harvard gastroenterology, right? Can anyone see why this might be considered an in-group kind of thing? Right? So except for the one poor girl, at least she's still from Boston though, right? So even she's from Boston, but she's from BMC. So they're literally all from Boston and 5 out of 6 are from MGH. So they have literally chosen people who trained together, worked together, and they're going to keep working with the same people that trained them. So they're basically the definition of an in-group at this point, right? And so while they're, I would suggest, actively looking for diversity in conventional metrics, they're perhaps still creating and recreating a very much in-group type of thinking. Now, maybe this isn't a justice equity issue, but it might be a way to not get the full benefits of diversity. And of course, I'm not picking on Harvard, I'm really not, but they do seem to be making a habit of this. And so this came out around the same time. So it doesn't seem to be an isolated incident. Yeah, they'll just not post it next year, is what they'll do. So to talk about my own experiences. So as you heard, I do work quite a bit with the American College of Surgeons. I work with Dr. Delman on the Committee of Ethics, which is one of the funnest committees around. And I know that's not a word, but I like using words that aren't words, but should be. You'll hear another one here in a bit. I got on the Committee of Ethics when I was part of the Young Fellows Association. And what I used to joke about is that when I was at that table, the diversity I brought was not because I was a brown woman necessarily, although for a time I probably was the only person of color. It's actually much more diverse now. It's a really great group, part of the ACS. But the diversity I brought was that I was the only person there who had not at some point trained in Boston or worked in Boston. It really felt that way. Like it felt like it was Boston and me. And again, it's changed now, but I was definitely still the only person working in a rural environment and aware of the very different way of practice and way of thinking and way of prioritizing things that came from that background. And that to me was very clear that that was really the diversity I brought to that particular table. So for example, when the issue came out about concurrent surgeries and performing concurrent surgeries, there were people at the table just scandalized that anyone would do that. And I was like, kind of raised my hand and said, okay, so I have about 1,000 burn patients a year to do. And if we don't do concurrent surgeries, they're not getting operated on because there's no other way to do it with the workforce we have. If you want burn patients to get their operations in a timely fashion and live and do better, we have to do concurrent surgeries. There's no other way. And it was just silence going, oh. And realizing that some of these things are resource-based. That perspective, if you don't hear it, if you don't know it, you think these are people just trying to make money by operating, in 2 rooms and putting patients in grave danger, not realizing this is actually a systematic thing for much of us in the country. So that was something that became clear. And so, as I've just said, I come from what's fondly referred to as flyover country, which is most of the country. And for those who don't know, a few of you have been to Lubbock. I was very surprised. Lubbock's right about there, is where it is. And I ended up there because I was doing a residency in Beth Israel in Manhattan, and I married a gentleman from Hobbs, New Mexico. And Texas Tech was the closest training program, really the only training program in that region. And so I moved as a PGY2 there. And I can tell you that was probably the biggest culture shock I've had. I've lived all over the world. Mom's Sri Lankan originally, and my parents were expatriates. So I've moved so by the time I was 11, I'd been to 7 different schools on 3 continents in 2 languages. I can tell you that I'm an outsider even in my own homeland of Sri Lanka at this point, because by the time I went to Sri Lanka, we'd just been in Antigua, so I spoke with a West Indian accent, and that didn't go down well. I really still don't speak Sinhalese very well. And so I'm the perennial outsider, so I totally get what that was. And still moving to Lubbock was a bit concerning for me, because I think we hold biases about rural America, which is red America, not completely, but substantially. And we worry about racism, prejudice, small town thinking for sure. Lubbock's grown in the years I've been there, but still, for most people, when I recruit from the coast, it's definitely a small town thing, or even from bigger cities. They're all Republicans, well, 80%, so it depends on your definition of all, but that was the feeling. And really this undertone that they're not very nice people. And as I recruit now as chair, I actually talk about these biases when I recruit anyone who's not familiar with the region, because I think it helps tackle them up front. And I can tell you there's one or two people who are very relieved that I bring it up, because of course they're never going to bring it up. And so it's important to talk about these things. But I think these biases are really quite real and quite ingrained, and they are biases, right? I mean, they're stereotypes by definition. And I think we sometimes overlook that we carry these. And if you don't live in that region, it's very easy to do. And the reason this is potentially harmful, so kind of, I'm taking you on a bit of a meandering story here, but it's to do with the rural surgery workforce. So this came out of the University of Washington. They have a research center devoted to this. And it basically showed, we all know that the general surgery workforce is declining, but the rural surgery workforce is declining much faster. And it is basically, rural surgeons are older, they're retiring, and no one is filling the gaps. We are not training rural surgeons in this country, even though it arguably is what the country needed. If you remember that map of flyover country, there's a lot of land to be covered, and actually a lot of people living in that land, maybe not densely, but they are there. And if you go to the ACS and you decide you want to be a rural surgeon, there are exactly 15 programs listed in 11 states that have any sort of rural surgery focus of all the surgery programs in this country. And mine isn't listed, interestingly. We just now formally did a rural track. And part of the problem is that there's no definition, right? So on the RRC where I'm working, we are working, Karen Brazel, and Stephanie from Mayo, they're working together to try to define rural surgery. We don't have good definitions. That's part of the problem, or we can't list more programs. Word of mouth, for those of us working in this region, we know which programs have a focus on rural surgery and want to increase rural surgeons, but it's really not defined. And so if you were a med student who maybe grew up in a rural town and you got into med school and now you're all excited, you want to be a surgeon, you want to go back and serve a community just like you grew up in, you don't have a lot of guidance on how you're going to do that. This is Plainview. So the reason I bring up this slide is to show you sort of the realities that you might not expect. And this is something I didn't expect. So Plainview, as you might guess from this slide, is not much of a town. It is about 1 hour from Lubbock. And Lubbock has Texas Tech. We have private hospitals. We are the medical hub for this region. It's one reason I actually agreed to go back and stay, is because I realized I could grow so much with no competition as the only academic center in all of West Texas. It really gives you huge hubs. So, for example, our burn center, I was telling people last night, we covered 350 plus miles. There's no burn center in El Paso, so that 2 million almost population around there comes to us too. We covered to Mexico, to Oklahoma, and New Mexico, because New Mexico doesn't have a burn center. So we cover huge swaths of geography. So we're a major hub. We're right there. We're 1 hour away from this little town. Plainview does have quite a nice little hospital. And there are 3 general surgeons, 2 of whom we've trained in the last 5 years and graduated from us, our work there. And they are doing a thriving business. Because in Plainview, if you want your gallbladder out or your hernia fixed, they would still rather have it done in their hometown by surgeons they know and they see as part of the community than drive just 1 hour to Lubbock and have it done. And this actually surprised me because it never dawned on me that 1 hour's drive would be that big a deal, but it makes a difference. And, then you can ask the question, is it reasonable? Well, that's another argument, but it's what the population seems to want. They would rather have their breast biopsy, their breast surgery, their hernia operation, their gallbladder done in their hometowns. And so the demand is there. It's not that it's going away. And yet there are some significant problems. And I apologize, I'm detouring a little bit here. I don't know how many of you are aware of this that just came out. It is the federal regulation listed there that was passed in the Senate bill listed there, that basically it was one of those omnibus, they sneak some legislation in an omnibus bill. It basically says that if you're a rural hospital and you're worried you might have to close, you can convert to an ER instead, and you'll get money from the federal government. That's basically what it is. And it seems like a great idea, right? Because it seems like that should help hospitals not completely close, and it's better to be an ER than nothing. Okay, so it's well-intentioned, like most of these things are. So here's the problem. What don't you get if you become an ER? Well, you don't have surgery and you don't have obstetrics, right? So two of the most crucial, what I would call primary care for rural health, vanishes the second a hospital chooses this. So this got passed about November or so. And last, about exactly 2 weeks ago now, I got an email. There was a big group of us in the rural surgery group that emailing back and forth, finding out what is ACS doing. Mike Sutherland, who's in charge of that at ACS, emails back. We're talking to the regents, doing things. But we got this email, and this was sent to like 60 people. It's not particularly private, but this is from a rural surgeon in Texas who's been practicing for more than a decade, serving that community, has a family, has kids, and as you can see, his hospital is now taking advantage of this bill and is going to become an ER next week. And you got to get your patients out. So either they get discharged and get better, or they get transferred, I assume. I'm not sure how else you get them out. And staff is gone and they're done. And this surgeon now has to start a new life somewhere else because you can't practice if you're a rural surgeon. Your hospital suddenly decides to become an ER. So this is a real crisis facing people. So bad enough, we don't have enough rural surgeons. We're not training enough rural surgeons. And then we're now having this, where if you are a rural surgeon, your hospital might just go poof, and you have nowhere to work. So it's a bit of a crisis. And I think we're going to hear more about this in the next few years. And I think all of this is going to hopefully push us to think a little bit about the rural perspective, including it. So tied to that, interestingly, is this other question of international medical graduates. And we all know I'm an international medical graduate. I graduated from the University of Sydney. It's kind of funny. So I graduated second in my class from the best medical school in Australia. So it was a bit of a surprise to me when I applied for residency in the US and found out I was a second class citizen. That was a little bit galling. But, I think it's an open secret that IMGs have been considered a little bit of a subcategory in surgical education, particularly for a while. What's ironic is that they disproportionately serve in underserved and rural areas, right? So it does all tie together. And so the question, I'm just going to leave you with this, I'm not going to elaborate for too long on it. Is it the last acceptable bias in surgery? Because most places do have stratification. They do have different points based on where your med school is. Is that acceptable? Is it a one size fits all? Do we stratify international schools by a certain ranking? How do we do this? I don't have the answers, by the way, but it is just something to think about. This was the email I got when I first applied to Texas Tech. I'm so mad at myself I didn't print it out because it would be framed above my chair right now if it was. But I didn't because I knew my husband before we got married. And so I had applied to Texas Tech the first go round. And I just literally it was like a 2-line email going, yeah, we don't hire foreign grads, CMI. And then the next year, we had a different program director, a new program director had come in and was willing to take me on, and I transferred, and the rest is history, as they say. They recruited me to stay, and that was that. But back in 2000, it was just as simple as saying, we just don't hire foreign grads. There's probably a lot of places now, they probably wouldn't send the email out like this, but there's probably a lot of places right now still that will not. So right now, we've obviously come a long way from the program I joined back then. You can decide if those numbers are good or bad, but I can tell you they're very different from when I joined. And they're actually different from when I joined as when I became chair 7 years ago as well. We have, in my view, clearly biased view, made significant progress. We do specifically look at applicants with a rural surgery background because we consider this part of our commitment. And so we do try at least every year to take one person who comes to us from a rural background and wants to go back and serve a rural background. We have had a military applicant as well, almost every other year at least. So we do try to take one military applicant if we can. And so I didn't put that on the slide, but we do look for diversity from a lot of areas, a lot of ways. We don't specifically select for IMGs, but we have IMGs in our program. And again, that's something that we try to take people who are doing really well, exceptionally well, but also have something extra that they're bringing to the table. We have a lot of people from Texas, of course, that's who applies to us, right? And we have our own residents and med students as well. And so it's always that balance, since it's a match and you don't know exactly who you'll get. You don't want to have everyone from your own institution or everyone from Texas. How do you strike that balance? On the flip side, when it comes to faculty, I make a very deliberate effort to recruit people trained elsewhere because I think that brings diversity of thought, diversity of training styles, and that seems to be working. So that was kind of the first part of the talk. The second part of the talk is, so assuming you have a diverse workforce, and I know that actually here you are very much on the forefront of having diversity within this department as well. It's quite impressive. Now what? And obviously that's kind of, again, rhetorical to take us on a story. Who's seen this movie? It's a really good movie. Okay, so more people than were in fraternities. Good job. So obviously about these three wonderful women scientists and mathematicians. And the reason I brought that up is so absolutely glorious movie highlighting all the discrimination they faced. But the reality is, what's interesting is NASA was actually ahead of its time compared to other places, even though it obviously focused on the negatives in that movie. By the 1960s, NASA was actively trying to increase ethnic diversity. 1960s, not very many other people were doing this. And so they were specifically focusing on astronauts, I think, as the most visible group. They were trying to include women, they were trying to include ethnic minorities. And then, of course, somewhere along the line, as this was all going along, this happened. Now, some of you are not old enough to remember this. I definitely do. And the Challenger was a big deal because it had been much hyped. And it was hyped because anyone in the room remember the name of the school teacher? Wow, you guys are good. All right. So Christy McAuliffe, who's second in the back row there, is the school teacher who was going. And so this was much hyped. A lot of you probably watched it on TV happening live. That's why everyone remembers it so well. Reagan was hyping this. It was a huge deal. And of course, it exploded about 11 seconds after launch. And that became a huge thing. And there's, of course, a lot of things looking at it. And, one of the things that came from all of this is it did contribute, even in medicine, to the culture of safety concept. Everyone understood that the pressure to launch was one of the factors that had happened. But I want to focus, as I tend to do, on another niche learning point from the Challenger disaster. And that's this man, who you may or may not have heard of, Alan McDonald. So Alan McDonald, I'm going to posit to you, was an outgroup person. He was an outsider. Now, he doesn't look like he might have been an outsider, but he was, because in NASA, while they were very much trying to increase diversity, what they hadn't thought of was the thing I brought up earlier. They were mostly having a straight MIT to NASA pipeline, was kind of how this worked. Their engineers came from a select group of universities, and they all trained the same way and in the same places, and they kept going and worked in the same teams. NASA felt that if you keep working with the same people, you do really well, right? And so NASA, without quite realizing it, had become a very in-group think kind of place. So why Alan was out-group is he actually didn't work for NASA. He was with a contractor, Morton Thurko. So industry, a little bit different, probably not a very diverse industry, actually, when you look at ethnic or gender stereotypes, but he was very much sort of stereotypical in that region, but an outgrouper for NASA. And his job was to submit a form on behalf of Morton Thurko to say that it was okay to launch. And he believed that this was dangerous because there were three reasons this was dangerous. And again, this is not a lecture in rocket science, but those were the three reasons he thought this was dangerous to launch. And so he didn't sign and realized Reagan is pushing on this launch, right? Like, this is a huge deal that he didn't sign it. So he didn't sign it. And of course, what did NASA do? They went ahead anyway, right? That's why the launch happened. Now, here's what's interesting. So they kind of buried this. And they not only buried this before it happened, they tried to bury it at the congressional hearing. So no one's mentioning that, hey, your main collaborator, the people building this rocket for you, said don't launch. No one's mentioning it. They're kind of glossing over it. And so here's the second heroic thing Alan did. So first, he refused to sign, put his entire career in jeopardy. Now he's sitting there in the back, the cheap seats is what he calls it. He's sitting in the back. And they're just not talking about the fact that it was like nobody knew this could possibly go wrong. No, we all thought this was going to be great. And he goes, wait, hold on. Morton Thurko put a letter in saying don't launch below this temperature. And then we put it in writing and sent it to NASA. And so he raises his hand and says this from the back seats of the auditorium. And the chair, Secretary of State, William Rogers, kind of squints and tries to see who it is and says, could you come to the front and say that again? So he did. And he basically blew open the cover-up NASA was desperately trying to put in place that, no, we did know there were risks and they went ahead anyway. And so as you can imagine, this was very fraught. So pop quiz, as you can tell, I like pop quizzes. Who thinks that, so that's option A and option B. So these are two things that could have happened after this very dramatic, tense congressional hearing. Who thinks it was option A? God, you're a cynical lot. Okay, So, so everyone thinks it's option B. All right. So the reason I put this particular pop quiz is everybody was going to be right. So firstly, they weren't happy, and in fact, they demoted him. So they didn't fire him entirely, but they demoted him. But then, this is one of the few instances where there's a happy ending. Congress got really mad about that, and they put in a resolution that Martin Teichel would never get a future NASA contract because of this. So then the company went oopsies and kind of put him back, and then they promoted him to VP. And then he did very well. And obviously, once everything was, the dust had settled, it was recognized that he was really one of the very few heroes of this story who tried to do the right thing. Okay, so where are we coming to? So to bring it back, a few lessons here, besides the culture of safety and all of that. Going against the grain is difficult, and it carries real risk. And that is very much true still today. It's true in surgery, it's true in space travel. And I think a hill that as a leader, I choose to die on, I always tell people, you got to pick your hills. You can't make everything, Armageddon. You really can't. But I think it is imperative, and this is something I personally believe and what I try to practice, is that if you bring someone into your team, they've got to have a voice. And you have to feel safe expressing divergent, even contrary opinions. This does not happen without intentional effort for all the things we've been talking about. Every human instinct in your body pushes you to not be the contrarian, right? Now, there are some people, and if you do personality testing, this will sometimes come out. I'm not a big fan of personality tests, but there are some people who will tend to be more likely to voice contrary opinions. One of my favorite faculty members, who's unfortunately no longer alive, was the guaranteed person to always voice a contrary opinion in every meeting. Like, it didn't matter what we were talking about, he would find a way. And it was annoying and irritating and absolutely essential. And I miss it now that he's dead and gone and won't be there anymore. We all miss it, because you kind of sense that something's missing when someone isn't trying to poke holes at what might go wrong. And if you don't have that person to say why the rocket launcher might fail, or why this planned course of action for this patient might not be the best one, I think we lose something. And so while we can't necessarily identify which person is going to have this personality to be both very smart and very willing to be, controversial all the time, there's a few of them. It's good to have one or two on the team. I think it is important that we encourage contrary opinions. And so what I've started to do now is, if I am having a faculty meeting, I try very hard not to have meetings that could have been emails. So if I'm having a meeting, it's to have some discussion around things. I will actively seek a contrary view and try to encourage it, because I'll want to hear, okay, someone tell me what could go wrong with this. Someone tell me why we shouldn't do this. Come on, someone think of a reason why this is a bad idea, not a good idea. And it's a bit artificial. I don't know if it works as well as when people naturally do this, but I think it is important. And if nothing else, it creates that culture of safety to express contrary opinions. And I think that's important. And to tie back to diversity, I do think that when we hire for all types of diversity, that is more naturally present in the group. We reduce that in-group thinking that we've been talking about. And I think it is a bit more of a natural fit. Obviously, more research needed on that one. Even if it's not of value to the group, it simply remains the right thing to do, to circle back. And I really like this quote here that sort of pieces together what we've been talking about, that equality and diversity is having a seat at the table. You've invited people to the table. Equity and inclusion is having a voice, but justice and belonging is only when that voice is heard. And obviously, it doesn't mean that that's always what the next course of action is going to be, but it means that that voice has had a fair chance to be heard, and that idea is being given equal validity as everything else. So to wind down, I'm going to do something I really hate to do, which is end on kind of a bummer note. And I tried very hard to craft the slides in a different way, but it just didn't feel natural. So in January, I discovered, and the reason that I've brought these last few slides up, that 2 of the 25, so there were a few women chairs recently appointed, so our numbers went up to 26 actually. And of those 26 women chairs in North America, so a little bit fewer if you count the US only, because 2 are Canadian, 2 of them had been forced to resign from their jobs. 10%. That's not great, right? And one of them's actually went public over this just about 2-3 weeks ago, and definitely was fine with this being shared, since she does want attention drawn to it. And obviously, not knowing details, but simply knowing that this was an issue of concern, I want to share this paragraph, and this is from the legal filing that's been done. So, Omeida Velasquez is kind of an academic superstar. I'm sure several of you know her. She's a vascular surgeon. She recently appointed to the National Academy. So she complained, according to the brief, that she was underpaid. And then the part that really resonated with me is that second line: attempts to marginalize her and undermine her authority. I will tell you that there's probably not a single woman leader who hasn't at some point felt that. And then retaliation, and then this is the other thing that really, really got me. So then, even though there's great performance by a lot of objective metrics, you're put on a performance improvement plan. And if you work in healthcare these days, and if you haven't seen patient safety concerns weaponized against people, I would be incredibly shocked, because I've seen it many, many times, where suddenly, you're being disruptive, or you're, endangering patient safety. And then eventually she's removed from her position. This is another amazing woman leader, Clay Cawthorn Burlew. So this happened July last year. And again, this is public because this is from the Orion's lecture that was done at East recently. And so this is what Clay shared during that lecture. This is a slide from her talk. And this is her resignation letter. Clay is a trauma superstar. She's been president of several societies. She's in the board of AAST. She has contributed hugely to the understanding of many, many aspects of trauma, and really just a lovely person. And if you look at that second paragraph, it tells you why she's resigning. And again, it's the criticisms that she felt were unjust, unwarranted, unrelated to clinical practice or skills, but resulted in differential treatment. So this is all within the last year. So I don't know quite what's wrong with 2023, but it's not going well for women leaders right now. And my personal take on this, and this is just an N of one, so take it for what it's worth, it's not based on any data, is that the higher you climb, the harder the wind blows. And I will tell you, so I get asked to speak on, as you might imagine, experiences as a woman surgeon in training all the time. And because I am brutally honest and blunt to a fault, I tell people, I didn't think it was bad at all in residency. I was fine. I went to a good old West Texas old boys school residency. It was tough on all of us. It was the kind of place where, okay, call me when the spleen's in the bucket. That's what your attending would say when we had a case, right? That's just how it was. And the thing, though, is we were all in equally bad shape. And so it was okay, because you worked really hard and you did your thing, incredible experience, none of, half of which wouldn't be allowed today, but incredible experience. And it was okay. I really did not feel discriminated against as a resident for my gender or my color or anything like that. I didn't. Maybe it was just me. I was maybe just pedal to the metal focused. I don't know, but I can't talk about it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It definitely happens, but I didn't perceive it. That's just my personal experience. Boy, when I became chair, that's when I perceived it. And it blows from every direction. So when I became chair, I inherited the role from Dr. John Griswold, who is just the nicest, loveliest human being. Had done it for 17 years. And there were some things that needed to be fixed in the department. And it was a succession plan. And so we had this thing, and then I was appointed. I'm the only chair at Texas Tech who was not a national surge. It was an appointment. It's not something they commonly do, but in this case, this is what we did. And despite all that, despite it being about as smooth a transition as you could expect, there was, we had residents, or at least one or two residents, going to the faculty and the PD going, do I need to leave? Do I need to go to another program? Because apparently the concept that this small brown woman is now going to be the chair instead of this lovely old white man that we're used to was going to collapse the whole program. I don't know. I'm not sure why. But they thought this was such a catastrophe that they needed to start looking for another program. And I say that because we tend to focus on the discrimination that comes from above, right? And truthfully, that's what hurts you most, right? Because that's who can fire you. But it comes from all directions. And just because you're younger does not make you immune to bias. And I like to make that clear. There is good data that for women, for sure, it's not as strongly noted in people of color and ethnic minorities, interestingly, but for women, the simple fact of being in a leadership position increases bias by both men and women. Who are below them. I mean, that's been well shown in the business literature. And so it definitely was true for me. Um, and using in healthcare, we have this particular problem that it's very easy to retaliate. So during COVID, I was threatened because I was speaking out too loudly for some people's comfort on PPE, and specifically that our RTs weren't being given good enough masks, and they were the highest risk people working with these patients all the time, and we didn't have enough tests and all of this. This was early 2020. And I had the CMO of a hospital. Texas Tech, by the way, has been lovely and nothing but lovely to me. So just to be clear, but we are a community medical school, so we have to work with different hospitals. We don't own the hospital, so they're not my bosses. But I had the CMO of one hospital literally threaten me in front of someone else, actually, so with a witness, to revoke my privileges by putting me through an executive process for being disruptive. Literally, just revoking your privileges, in case you don't know, is reportable to the National Practitioner Data Bank and to the board. It hurts your career. Just that was easy as that. And I was the chair of surgery, working and the chief of surgery at that hospital. So it's that easy. And so it is still what the piece I want to highlight here is there is no plateau. It sometimes feels like you fight and you fight and you fight as a junior and you get to a certain spot and then you chill out. Yeah, bad news, there's not a chilling out spot. That's very depressing. And I'm so sorry to have to leave you on that note. If I could have found a way to put it on earlier and then end on a happy note, I would have. But I am going to end on a few practical points, given that reality. So workplace bias has not gone away. It has become more insidious and more creative in how it's used. So this is something I wish I had done when I first became chair, is to get an employment lawyer on retainer. So here's the thing. The way the law works, or the legal system works, you pay a retainer. If you don't use it, you get it back. So it's like the best several thousand you'll never actually hopefully need, right? And then in some years you go, hey, I want my retainer back. We're not using it. They're all good. Now, I don't know if I would source it from right around here where you all are, because I just have a sneaking suspicion that your employment lawyers charge a heck of a lot more than anywhere else in the country, just a hunch. But here's the nice thing. You can get an employment lawyer from anywhere in the country, and unless they actually have to represent you, they do not have to be state licensed in your state. And if they do, if you go to a company that's worth their salt, they will have connections in the state that you practice in, if that becomes necessary. So you can look all over the country for people specializing in employment law. Here's the reason why. So recently, I worked really hard to help a junior faculty member who was, again, in my view, being targeted for unfair peer review by a hospital. And again, this is the problem when you don't own your hospital, it's a different entity. So the thing is, when people are targeting you, they don't give you time because it's not in their interest to give you time. So everything becomes this emergency. Every meeting is held tomorrow, and you will not have time to go find an employment lawyer, guarantee you, because it took heaven and earth for us to get him one in time. And we sorted out the situation. I was able to move him to a different hospital. Everything settled down. But that taught me the lesson that you don't have time. And so having someone on standby, I strongly recommend. And so this is something as of 2023 is adding to my repertoire of advice. Know your EEOC office. I've actually worked with our EEOC office on other things. Complaints have come to me about people in my team, sexual harassment, things like that. And they have been nothing but amazing to deal with. And in general, they are very well-trained, solid office in my experience. And I've worked with the EOCs in multiple contexts. And so I would recommend getting to know them. I think that helps if you want some advice, if there's a situation where you feel you might be getting discriminated against. As with everything else, document electronically. So it's time stamped. So it's obvious that you documented in real time and didn't make all this stuff up 10 years later, right? I don't recommend recording conversations surreptitiously. People ask about that. It's legal in Texas. You only need one party consent, which is a funny term because it just means that you consent to yourself recording someone else. But Texas is one party consent. So technically in Texas, a patient can record you, you can record anyone else. California is two party, just so you know, so don't try that. But I wouldn't necessarily do it because that sets up an adversarial environment. But everywhere in the country, you make notes right afterward. And I definitely recommend if you're having an interaction that you suspect might not end up going well, you document in real time right afterward. And I did promise you there was another made up word. So this is a George Bush word. Strategery, and it's not a word, but it really should be because I like strategery. Use strategery if you're having to fight a good fight, right? Sometimes it means you cave on a battle to win the war. Sometimes you live to fight another day. Sometimes you gather your troops and go all in. But you need to be strategic about these things, because the problem is in these incidents, even if you end up filing suit, you usually get hurt, and people, it doesn't often end well. And so ideally, a lawsuit is your last resort, and you try to avoid that. Thank you all very much for having me. It's been a real honor to give this talk, and I hope we have a few moments for questions.